Most people have probably heard of Bluey by now. Even if you haven't, I'm sure you've seen the merchandise and characters elsewhere before, whether in a store or online. I had just finished an extraordinarily hard day at work at the psychiatric institution. I decided to go to my local superstore to pursue some movies for some comfort and escapism. When I arrived, I eagerly explored the DVD sections. It wasn't long before I came across a DVD box case that piqued my interest. A ripped Bluey case with a single episode named Bandit Loses It listed on the reverse. The cover of the case appeared to be a family photo, except for Bandit. Everyone had a sad expression on their face. And this puzzled me because the family was typically upbeat and cheerful. I carefully picked up the case, placed it in my bag, and began walking towards the person at checkout, so I wouldn't feel so alone at the store. I was in the middle of the conversation with the cashier when she abruptly paused and looked at me nervously. "Are you sure you want to check this one out?" she said, twirling her hair nervously. "Yeah, is there something wrong with it?" I responded nonchalantly. "No, it's just, well..." The person who returned the tape said that the contents contained something that were, rated M? She replied. What? What is this, a video game or something? I laughed. Go ahead and check it out. She checked the DVD out and I paid. I excitedly grabbed the case and dashed out of the automatic doors. I smiled as I got into my car and looked at the case again. I placed the case down on my lap, stuck my key into the ignition, and drove back home. When I got home, I threw my jacket on the floor and kicked off my shoes. I went into the living room and turned on the television. I then removed the DVD from its case and inserted it into the DVD player. I went to the kitchen and popped some popcorn before sitting down and pressing the play button on the remote. As I waited for the DVD player to start, I fiddled with the case in my hand. I was greeted with an interactive menu with the cover of the case in the background. There were only two options available to me: play and exit. A blue oval surrounded play, and the orange oval surrounded exit. When I pressed the play button, the screen briefly went black before the Bluey intro began to play. The introduction was normal, with the family playing musical statues. The music came to a halt and they all shouted "Mom" as they did in every episode. So far, nothing's come up, I told myself. When I said that, the music stopped and everyone exclaimed, "Bingo!" This was not an ordinary episode, I realized. As I watched, I started munching on my popcorn, wondering where this was going. The music abruptly ceased, and they all exclaimed, "Bluey." The music resumed and became more intense until Bandit leaped up in the air, and they all exclaimed, "Dad." It then cut to the title card, which reads, "Bandit Loses It." It was read by a male voice that didn't sound like Bandit's voice actor. The episode began with Bandit leaving the kids' room, closing the door, and walking down the hall. The camera then pans to the healer's study. For a few seconds, nothing happens until Bandit opened the door, entering and shut it. He approached his desk and sat on the ball, and then turned his head to face the viewers. So I guess I'm your favorite character," he said cheerfully. "I'm sure you've always wanted an episode centered on me, and now you have one." He then stood up and ran towards the viewer, and then cuts to a supermarket. He stuffed a cabbage into a silver tote bag. He then looked at the viewer and ran towards them before the scene could cut to the living room. Aside from the floating rocks, the living room appeared normal. Bandit entered the room holding the cabbage. He knelt and placed the cabbage in the center of the floor. He clasped his hands together and began to pray in a language I didn't understand. As the cabbage began to tremble, the rocks began to glow a bright beet red. The cabbage then ruptured, releasing a shadow that ran into the viewer before cutting to a microsecond image of a man in a forest. The scene cut back to the living room and everything was normal except for Bandit. At this point, I was questioning what the heck was going on. Why does Bandit keep running towards the viewer? Why did Bandit perform such a strange ritual? What was that shadow? Why is Bandit the only character in the episode so far? I went to the kitchen, got a glass of water, and gulped it down. Then I headed back to the living room and sat back down again. Bandit appeared to be holding a large knife covered in a black, mysterious liquid. His right arm was covered in scratch marks. I wondered if the shadow entity had done this to him. I pressed play and kept watching. Bandit got up and slowly walked towards the viewer until it was covered by his face. The screen turned black for a second and cut back to a drawing of his face that was more detailed. This was a rare occurrence in the show, usually occurring for short periods of time to accommodate a joke or a close-up of something. During these occurrences, the characters' faces would either have a curious expression or puppy dog eyes. Bandit's expression was neither. Bandit wore a serious expression on his face. "This is what I have to do to keep this family alive. The food here has been contaminated by interdimensional beings," he yelled angrily, hurling the knife to the ground. "I'm finished with this snip! I'm finished!" he screamed. It then cuts to black, followed by a wide backshot of Bandit on his knees outside of a grocery store entrance. The only light in the environment came from the grocery store's lights. There were several beet red glowing rocks humming around the store. Bandit clasped his hands together and began to pray in a language I didn't understand after a few seconds. The store then burst open and several shadowy entities began fleeing. As he ran towards the viewer, Bandit pulled out an automatic assault rifle and began firing into the crowd. Then cuts to a front view of Bandit driving a car and occasionally shooting out the window. The scene kept going for a solid 20 seconds. I kept staring, completely absorbed by the story unfolding on the screen, and then cuts to Bandit in Healer's study, who smiles briefly before cutting to a man holding a cabbage in the woods. The man grabbed the cabbage and began eating it raw. From his chest popped out a skeleton. It then cuts to the end credits. When I saw the skeleton, I puked, peed my pants, and fell to the ground. It was so frightening that I passed out and I awoke an hour later. I washed my hands and changed my clothes. I carefully removed the disc and replaced it in the case. I dashed out of the house, slamming the door shut because of my shaking hands. I had difficulty inserting the key into the ignition, but I succeeded. I then drove to the store and dashed inside, clutching the case. I slammed it on the cashier's table. I dashed up to the cabbages and began ripping them apart with my hands, terrified. When I finished, I collapsed to my knees and sobbed. And when I wiped away my tears and looked up, I noticed a skeleton had popped out. In fear and surprise, as your eyes widen, your mouth goes dry with each battered breath. You try to scream, your mind begs to leave, glued to your computer screen. The killers they slash, the tapes burn and crash. The cartridge you bought will be your final haunt. The rituals of hate will seal your fate. The tears you shed will be from the fear-gripping horror-driven, nightmarish, gore-filled, terrorizing, hateful, burning, violent, rage-inducing, knife-slashing, blood-splattering, silent screams. Only time will tell if you will escape this online hell. Your horror-filled obsessions will come with its own regressions. Your pathetic screams will not be heeded in any way, because your nightmares will come at